In the wake of World War II's formal end in May 1945, Europe was left in a state of devastation. The war had torn apart not only the political and social fabric of the continent, but also its infrastructure. Factories, once the engines of wartime production, now stood silent, many reduced to rubble by air raids, others left abandoned in the wake of a collapsing regime. Among these silent industrial relics were the German forced labor factories, where millions of people had been exploited for the Nazi war effort. The liberation of these sites, often by advancing Allied forces, marked a new chapter in the long aftermath of the war. Yet, for many of these factories, the end of active combat did not mean the end of their role in history. In fact, it was only the beginning of a more complex and often uncomfortable story. Forced labor had been a central component of Nazi Germany's war economy. Between 1939 and 1945, an estimated 12 million people, including Jews, POWs, and civilians from occupied countries, were subjected to inhumane conditions in factories, mines, and other industries. The factories themselves were both a symbol of Nazi militarism and a testament to the system of exploitation that underpinned much of the war effort. With the war over, the factories were left in a state of disrepair, their purpose seemingly obsolete. But the pressing needs of post-war Europe, especially the dire shortages of goods, materials, and labor, ensured that these factories would not remain idle for long. At the close of the war, the Allies faced an unprecedented challenge: the rebuilding of Europe. The devastation of infrastructure was staggering, and the material and economic cost was vast. Germany, once the heart of European industrial production, lay in ruins. Among the many things left behind were hundreds of factories that had relied on forced labor to maintain their operations. Many of these factories were located in areas that had been heavily bombed, and some had been dismantled by the retreating Nazi forces, leaving only skeletons of what had once been centers of industrial activity. The early post-war years were marked by a struggle to comprehend what to do with these remnants of Nazi exploitation. Some factories, particularly those in the western zones of occupation, were repurposed for the reconstruction of Germany and Europe. However, the forced labor component of these factories could not simply be forgotten. The first decision faced by the Allies was whether to dismantle these sites entirely or to attempt to salvage them for future use. The process of dismantling began almost immediately after liberation. In the eastern zones, the Soviet Union took control of many of these factories, stripping them of machinery and shipping it back to the USSR. In the western zones, the United States and Britain initially considered similar measures, but economic necessity led to a different path. Factories that had once produced military goods were now called upon to support the war-torn economies of Europe. For example, a number of German aircraft factories were repurposed to produce civilian goods, including bicycles, consumer goods, and in some cases, automobiles. The heavy machinery used for manufacturing military supplies was often adjusted or repaired to create civilian products. However, the repurposing of these factories was not without its complications. The machinery, much of it damaged by the war, was often outdated and inefficient for civilian production. Additionally, the forced labor that had kept these factories running during the war was no longer available, and labor shortages were a serious concern. In many cases, local populations were reluctant to work in these factories, having just emerged from the horrors of Nazi occupation. In the Soviet-occupied East, the policy was different. The Soviet Union, which had suffered immense casualties and destruction during the war, took a more direct approach. Not only did they dismantle and transport much of the machinery to the USSR, but they also sought to integrate some of the industrial facilities into the socialist economy. Many of these factories were re-established as state-run enterprises, often under a new guise, but with the same labor-intensive production processes. Despite the heavy war damage and lack of experienced workers, the Soviet Union pushed to restart production at any cost. Forced labor, though technically outlawed, was often still part of the picture. Prisoners of war, political prisoners, and even former Nazi collaborators were put to work in these factories, not unlike the forced laborers of the past. As Western Germany began its slow path to recovery, the question of what to do with the factories that had been central to Nazi industry became more pressing. The United States, which had taken control of the western zones of Germany, initially advocated for the deindustrialization of the country. There was a belief that dismantling much of Germany's industrial base would prevent the resurgence of military aggression. However, this policy quickly gave way to pragmatism. As Europe's economy struggled to recover, it became clear that Germany's industrial capability was essential to the rebuilding process. The Western Allies allowed for the rebuilding of many factories, but the legacy of forced labor remained. The question of compensation for the forced laborers was another issue that emerged immediately after the war. The scale of exploitation and suffering was incomprehensible, yet the resources to compensate the victims were severely limited. The International Tracing Service, an organization formed by the Allies to help identify and aid victims of the Nazi regime, began the difficult task of documenting the identities of forced laborers, but the full extent of compensation would not come until much later. The moral and financial challenges of compensating those who had suffered in these factories were immense. In many cases, forced laborers were simply forgotten in the rush to rebuild, with their suffering marginalized in the face of the larger task of reconstruction. While much of the focus was on the immediate needs of post-war Europe, the fate of the factories became an increasingly contentious issue. The need for industrial production was undeniable, yet the legacy of forced labor could not be easily erased. For the victims, these factories had been sites of trauma, and for the Allies, they represented a difficult reminder of the scale of Nazi exploitation. The factories' post-war fates were varied and often contradictory. Some were repurposed for civilian production, others dismantled and forgotten. A few were preserved as monuments to the suffering that had taken place within their walls, but these efforts were limited by the pressing demands of the time. In the end, the fate of the German forced labor factories was dictated by a combination of economic necessity, political considerations, and the sheer scale of the war's destruction. The factories themselves, once central to the Nazi war machine, were now relics, their pasts intertwined with the suffering of millions. Yet, even as the world moved forward, these factories remained in the background of Europe's recovery, quietly reminding the world of the price of war, the human cost of industry, and the difficult choices made in the name of rebuilding a continent from the ashes. The aftermath of World War II had left a fractured Europe in its wake, and the fate of German forced labor factories remained deeply entangled in this reconstruction effort. While some had been quickly dismantled and others repurposed for civilian uses, the factories that had once symbolized Nazi exploitation continued to hold complex and often uncomfortable places in the narrative of post-war recovery. By the end of the 1940s, as reconstruction gained momentum and the scars of war began to heal, the question of what to do with these factories became more pressing. Were they to be destroyed completely, or were they to be utilized in some manner, their pasts inevitably shaping their futures? In the years following the war, economic pressures forced many nations, particularly in Western Europe, to grapple with a delicate balancing act. On one hand, the destruction of much of the industrial base in Germany and across Europe left a vacuum that needed to be filled in order to begin rebuilding. On the other, the historical associations with these factories, the forced labor, the Nazi-era exploitation, made them uncomfortable symbols for the new post-war order. The first major post-war action involving the forced labor factories was the broader program of dismantling, which initially began under Allied supervision, particularly in the Soviet and French zones of occupation. Soviet authorities took swift action, not only dismantling the factories themselves but also removing machinery and equipment, which was then transported back to the Soviet Union for use in their own war-torn economy. The focus of the Soviets was on securing industrial assets that could serve as a base for the reconstruction of their socialist economy. While forced labor had officially ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union continued a similar practice of exploiting captured German prisoners of war and other displaced persons to staff these repurposed factories. In contrast, the Western Allies, most notably the United States and the United Kingdom, took a more cautious approach in the early years following the war. Both countries initially supported the policy of deindustrialization, hoping to curb any future resurgence of German militarism. However, as the Cold War began to take shape in the late 1940s, It became apparent that Germany's industrial capacity would be essential for the reconstruction of Europe. This realization, coupled with the American-led Marshall Plan, which provided financial assistance to rebuild Europe, led to a shift in policy. It became clear that to support the economic recovery of Western Europe, Germany's industrial base would need to be restored, including the repurposing of factories that had once been involved in the Nazi war effort. Yet, as factories were returned to civilian production, the specter of their pasts remained a significant issue. The massive industrial complex that had once supported the Nazi war machine now found itself caught between two worlds, one focused on rebuilding Europe, the other on confronting the moral and historical consequences of its wartime legacy. In particular, the forced labor component of these factories posed a challenge for post-war administrations. The labor used in these factories had been, for the most part, composed of people who had been forcibly brought to Germany from occupied countries. Many of these workers had been subjected to horrific conditions, and their treatment during the war became an important aspect of the post-war reckoning. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, efforts to provide compensation and recognition to the survivors of forced labor had begun to take shape. However, these efforts were slow and uneven. The German government, which had been under Allied control until 1949, faced immense pressure from both the international community and its own people to address the issue of forced labor. In the early years after the war, there were few resources available to compensate the millions of people who had been subjected to forced labor. The reconstruction of Germany itself was an expensive and challenging task, and the issue of forced labor was often overshadowed by more immediate economic concerns. Moreover, as Germany's political landscape shifted in the post-war years, with the division of the country into East and West, the issue of forced labor became further complicated by Cold War politics. In West Germany, the focus was largely on rebuilding the country and integrating it into the Western Bloc, while in East Germany, under Soviet influence, the labor issue was also linked to the broader ideological struggle. Meanwhile, the factories themselves continued to play a crucial role in the economic recovery of Europe. Many were converted for civilian uses, but this was not always an easy process. The conversion from wartime production to civilian manufacturing required significant adjustments in machinery, labor practices, and organizational structures. For example, many of the factories that had produced military aircraft were retooled to produce civilian aircraft or automobiles. However, the machinery used to make military products was often not well suited to the demands of peacetime production, and the labor force that had once staffed these factories, whether forced laborers or others, was now absent. Local populations in many regions, particularly those in Germany, were reluctant to return to work in factories that had been associated with the horrors of the past. This presented a significant obstacle to the rebuilding process. Moreover, the sheer scale of the machinery and infrastructure in these factories, many of which had been purpose-built for wartime needs, meant that repurposing them for civilian use was often impractical and expensive. In West Germany, however, there was a growing recognition that these factories, while tainted by their past, could not be simply left to decay. By the early 1950s, German industrialists were lobbying the government to allow the full-scale resumption of factory production, arguing that it was essential for the country's economic survival. Factories that had once produced tanks, ammunition, and aircraft were now producing goods like household appliances and cars. The German automotive industry, which had been decimated by the war, would eventually be rebuilt on the backs of these converted factories, leading to the rise of major companies like Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz. These factories, once symbols of the Nazi war machine, would go on to form the backbone of Germany's economic miracle, a period of rapid growth and recovery that lasted from the 1950s to the 1970s. However, the memory of forced labor continued to haunt these factories, even as they were repurposed for civilian production. In the decades following the war, there were ongoing efforts to bring attention to the plight of the forced laborers. In the 1990s, as the full extent of the suffering endured by these workers became more widely recognized, German companies began to pay compensation to surviving forced laborers. In 1999, the German government, in cooperation with businesses, established a foundation to compensate survivors of forced labor. This move came after years of pressure from human rights organizations and the international community, as well as the growing acknowledgement within Germany that the country's post-war economic recovery had been built, in part, on the backs of forced labor. The legacy of these factories is not a simple one. In many ways, they embody the complexity of the post-war period, the drive for economic recovery, the painful reckoning with the past, and the uncomfortable blending of former symbols of Nazi oppression with the rebuilding of a new, democratic Europe. Some of the factories involved in forced labor have been preserved as historical sites, reminders of the atrocities committed there. Others have been repurposed so completely that little remains to indicate their pasts. But for the millions of forced laborers who endured unimaginable suffering, these factories remain a symbol of exploitation and loss, their stories too often overshadowed by the broader narrative of post-war recovery. In the final analysis, the fate of the German forced labor factories after the war is a story of transformation, of uncomfortable reconciling with history, and of economic necessity triumphing over moral clarity. They were not only monuments to the war but also to the rebuilding that followed, rebuilding that relied on both the material resources left behind and the painful, often forgotten, labor that powered them. The complex legacy of these factories is one that continues to provoke questions about memory, justice, and the ways in which societies rebuild after the trauma of war.